Today's class will focus on a Hasidic discourse penned by the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneersohn. Last week we surveyed his life very briefly, and I mentioned that a few days before his passing, he submitted for publication a discourse that he had said and written years earlier to be studied on the 10th day of the month of Shvat, which was the yahrzeit of his grandmother. And that was his custom to publish discourses for special occasions. In his last years, he wasn't able to speak publicly. So what he would do, instead of speaking, is he would submit for publication discourses that he had said previously. This discourse that we're going to discuss today and give a synopsis of it today was actually written by him and said in 1923. And it was interesting that the first time it was said and written, that was the first time the Rebbe, the previous Rebbe's son-in-law, our Rebbe, met with his father-in-law before he was his father-in-law. So it's interesting that this discourse was then issued again as his final discourse, which was intended, you could see, to create a bridge between his leadership and the leadership of his successor, his son, the Rebbe. As I mentioned last week, this discourse is actually four separate discourses, a continuation. They're all connected, totaling 20 chapters. And when the Rebbe assumed leadership, a year later after the passing of his father-in-law, he delivered a discourse on chapter 1 of his father-in-law's discourse. And then the next year he delivered a discourse on chapter 2. And this went on for 20 years, and then he started the cycle again. And today we have 2 thick volumes of those discourses, just the ones that he said on the yahrzeit, the passing of his father-in-law. But we're going to do the synopsis of his father-in-law's discourse, which is a commentary on a biblical verse in the book called Song of Songs, Shir HaShirim. Well, let me just give a little bit of an introduction. Shir HaShirim, if you read it, it's a collection of love songs, very sensual love songs, composed by King Solomon. The Talmud, quoting Rabbi Akiva, says that all of the teachings of the Torah, all of the songs are holy. The Song of Songs is the holy of holies. Why is it considered to be so holy? It's a love song between two lovers, because the two lovers are God and Israel. And the whole Song of Songs, if you read it the right way, it goes through the history of how God chose the Jewish people, took them out of exile of Egypt, gave them the Torah, and so on. So the Song of Songs is actually the most intimate relationship, expresses the most intimate relationship of God and Israel. And near the end of this song, this biblical song, there's a verse that reads, Basi Legani, Achosi Kala. I have come to my garden, my sister the bride. God is speaking here. He's the man in this metaphor. And we are the lover. We are the ones that God loves, and he refers to us affectionately as my sister, my bride. We're not going to go into why he refers to us as a sister and a bride, because there are 2 forms of love, but we're not going to go into that right now. That's not what the discourse is about. The midrash, which is a collection of rabbinic teachings commenting on the biblical verses, says the following. It doesn't say, Basi Legan, I've come to the garden, my sister the bride. it says, I've come to my garden. So the midrash makes 2 points over here. That the word ligani, to my garden, could actually be read as lignuni, to my bridal chamber. And I have returned to my bridal chamber. What does that mean? So the midrash explains that when God created the world and Adam and Eve, the divine presence, the essence of the divine presence was here on earth. This world was receptive to the divine. But what happened as a result of Adam and Eve transgressing, partaking of the forbidden fruit of the tree of knowledge, the divine presence withdrew to the first of 7 heavens. Doesn't mean physically withdrew. God doesn't occupy physical space that he could withdraw physically, but it means that his presence was removed from this world in a way that God's presence was elusive, was harder to find. When Cain killed Abel, that was the next major sin, the divine presence withdrew another rung, another notch to the second heaven. In other words, finding God's essence was becoming more challenging. When the next sin, I'm not going to go through all 7 sins, but the next sin was Enosh. That was the next generation. When people started to recognize other gods, idolatry started off its downward trend, where people was beginning to glorify and deify. And this is just interesting. You ask any secular anthropologist, and they'll tell you that originally people were idol worshippers, and monotheism came later. No, it's not that way. Monotheism was the original. Adam and Eve were monotheists. Cain and Abel were monotheists. It began to degenerate afterwards into idolatry. But the world started off with a belief in one God. But at any rate, as a result of the next generation of sin, the divine presence went to the 3rd heaven. And then to the generation of the flood, it went to the 4th heaven. The generation of the Tower of Babel, the 5th heaven. The Sodomites, the Egyptians went to the 6th and 7th heaven. That means that the divine presence was as elusive as one could possibly become elusive. God was so far removed from the consciousness of the world. But then God says, Basi ligani, I've returned to my garden, to my bridal chamber. I'm back now. How did he get back? Well, it started a process of seven stages. For Abraham came into the picture, and Abraham brought the divine presence down from the 7th heaven to the 6th. Isaac from the 6th to the 5th. Jacob from the 5th to the 4th. Jacob's son Levi, and then the next generation Amram, and then Moses, who was the 7th. And all 7s are beloved, the midrash says. And this brought the divine presence back into this world. Moses was the one who brought it back into this world. Moses had a unique quality that he was the 7th, and 7s are beloved. The 7th day of the week is Shabbat, is the beloved day. The 7th month is the month of Tishrei, is the beloved month. The 7th year is the sabbatical year, and so on and so forth. It lists a whole bunch of 7s that are special. And Moses was the 7th generation, and he brought the divine presence back into this world. And therefore God says, I'm back. I come back to my bridal chamber, because in the beginning of creation, God's relationship to the world was a very loving one, a very intimate one. And that intimacy was now restored through Moses. That's the midrash. And just an aside, people, when the previous Rebbe passed away, since he didn't leave a will, people were looking for hints as to who should succeed him. And they looked up the midrash that the previous Rebbe refers to, saying, I'm referring to this particular midrash, who was the author of the statement that we just went through. It's a rabbi by the name of Menachem, who was the son-in-law of another great rabbi, So people saw in this a hint, among many other hints, that he was already alluding to the fact that his son-in-law, whose name was Menachem, should succeed him. And there are many other hints that we won't go into right now. Okay, so now we have a understanding of what God had in mind when he created the world. God's purpose in creating the world is he desired to create a physical world unlike the spiritual realms that are aware of godly presence, a physical world that in and of itself, in its own perception, doesn't have a recognition of the divine. And this physical world, which is the lowest of all the different worlds, because there are many different spiritual realms, but this is the lowest of the low, that we should become eventually a place that is hospitable to God. To use the language of the midrash, God desired to have a dwelling place in the lowest or lowliest of realms. So what does God do? God creates a world with a potential for him to be present in this world. And then, almost by design, God orchestrates 7 terrible sins whereby the divine presence leaves this world only to come back into this world through the efforts of 7 righteous people: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Levi, Kahas, Amram, and Moses. Yes?
I just was wondering, is it true that the word olam means concealment?
Right. The Hebrew word for world, olam, actually comes from a root which means concealed. That God created a world in which his presence would be concealed. But our job is to reveal it. Now, how did Moses bring the divine back into this world? In what way did it manifest itself? He brought us the Torah, the revelation at Mount Sinai. But that was a one-time thing. How long did it take for God to say the 10 Commandments? Not a very long production. So the divine revealed itself. But then where did he really make the divine palpable? It was through the creation of the Mishkan, of the Tabernacle, the portable sanctuary in the desert, which later on evolved into a Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. But it started off as a portable sanctuary in the desert. And that's why the Torah says, "Make for me a sanctuary, and I will dwell in them." So the Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, quotes a midrash that says, isn't the language over here a little bit inconsistent? Make for me a sanctuary, one sanctuary, and I will dwell in them. It should say, I will dwell in it. So the midrash says, this is to teach you that every one of us has to create a sanctuary. Every one of us has to create their own personal sanctuary in which God will dwell. The model for that, the paradigm for that, was the Mishkan, the sanctuary in the desert, and later on the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. But the truth is that it's not just a one-place process. Every one of us has to create a sanctuary in his own life. How do we do that? So the previous Rebbe quotes a Zohar. The Zohar says, when a person suppresses the other side is a term used in kabbalistic literature to mean the forces of evil. Forces of evil are just the other side of holiness. When you suppress the other side, you generate the glory of God in all the worlds. Now, what does that mean, in all the worlds? A simple understanding is that you generate godly light in all of the different realms. You make them more radiant, more holy. But the previous Rabbi gives a novel interpretation based on a concept in Kabbalah and Hasidic philosophy. God manifests himself in 2 ways. One way is called Mimale Kol Almin. He fills all the worlds. He permeates all the worlds. That means it's the energy that God generates from himself to give life to each and every aspect of creation according to its nature. Which means we have, let's say, 4 spiritual worlds. God's light in the highest of worlds is qualitatively much more radiant, much more pronounced than it is in one of the lower worlds. Every world receives a different aspect of God's light, because from this perspective, God modulates, or he makes sure that this light should fit into each thing according to its capacity. So the light that exists in let's say the human being, God's energy is stronger than it is in an animal, which is stronger than it is in a plant, stronger than it is in an inanimate object. And every spiritual realm has a different perception of that divine. That's one way God generates his energy. But then there's God who transcends, sovev kol almin. He encompasses all the worlds, that all the worlds are equal in relation to that energy. That's a transcendent energy. That it's not any greater in the highest of worlds, and it's not any lower in the lowest of worlds. It's equal in all the worlds. It's a much more pronounced revelation of God's existence. And when you suppress the other side, when you suppress the evil in ourselves, when we suppress our evil, we generate this higher level of the divine energy. And that's the ultimate goal of creating a sanctuary, that we should engage in what is called in Aramaic itkafia, suppressing the evil, which then leads to ithapcha, transforming the evil. Once a person gains total mastery over the negative forces in one's life, then they can reach a point where they can even transform the negative into something positive. So that's how do we bring God's presence into this world? By creating a sanctuary. How do we create the sanctuary? Through the process of itkafia, of suppressing the evil, and then transforming the evil. That's the premise that the previous Rebbe lays out for us. And then he says this is exactly why in the temple, in the Mishkan, and then later on the Beit HaMikdash, what was the primary function? What did they do most of the time? Most of the time, it was offering sacrifices. In Hebrew, the word for sacrifice is karban. We'll soon explain what that word means, but it's usually translated as sacrifices. So, what does that have to do with what we were discussing? What is the whole idea of a sacrifice? When they did sacrifices, they were accompanied by the Levites who would sing. Why do you sing when you're bringing sacrifices? What does singing have to do with sacrifices? Because when they brought sacrifices, well, it was a physical thing, it was really a spiritual energy that they generated. And the song was there to elevate them. Song elevates. Yesterday was actually called the Shabbat of Shira, the Sabbath of song. And in Kabbalah, the idea of a song is the process of elevation. That's why music elevates people. Prose, just speech, could sometimes be very boring, but music is something that elevates the person. So in the temple, they brought these sacrifices, which was accompanied by the Kohen who did the service and the Levites who did the singing. But what exactly is a sacrifice? So the truth of the matter is that there is no such word sacrifice in Hebrew. I don't even know if there is a Hebrew word that translates as sacrifice. We use the word karban as sacrifice, but that's not what the word means. Karban, the root of the word is karov, close. The idea of a karban is to bring you close to God, to bring you and the animal within you close to God. And this is based on the way the Torah introduces sacrifices. It says, Adam, a person, ki yakriv, who will offer, mikem, from you. It should have said grammatically, Adam mikem, one of you who offers a sacrifice. But it says, one who offers a sacrifice from you. What does that mean? So the Rebbe explains that means that the sacrifice is not from the animal That's just the outer shell of it. The sacrifice is from you. That every one of us has the power to bring a sacrifice. But what is a sacrifice? It's not a sacrifice, it's getting near. Korban is getting closer to God. Every person has the ability to get close to God. Number one, everyone has the ability, and the sacrifice has to come from you. It's not just the animal. The animal was just the metaphor that represented what happens inside the person. The person has to bring the offering from his or her own animal soul. And the Torah talks about two kinds of animals, an ox or a lamb. What's the difference? There are two kinds of animal souls, actually more than two kinds, but two general kinds. There's the raging ox, the bull in the china shop type of animal soul, the real hostile, angry, domineering type. And then there's the meek, the timid, the one that's totally obsessed with physical pleasures, but not threatening to anyone, but that's still an animal soul. And you have to take your animal soul, whatever kind of animal soul you have, and you have to bring that close to God. And what do they do in the temple? They would bring the offering on the altar, and a fire would consume the offering. Now the Talmud tells us that during the times of the first temple, the fire that descended never left the altar. They didn't even have to add wood for the fire. They had wood there, but the fire, which had the shape of a lion, remained throughout the first temple's existence and consumed all the sacrifices. And it was a fire that came from heaven, from above, and it's a fire that couldn't be extinguished. What does that mean in terms of our own lives when we bring our own offerings to God? What that means, we all have a godly soul that has this passion, this fiery passion for God. And it can't be extinguished. No matter how low a person will go, the godly soul never loses its passion for God. And that's what the purpose of the korban. What do we do to get close to God? We have to make sure that the animal in us becomes consumed with the fiery passion of the godly soul. How do we do that? So the Rebbe explains that the animal soul, even though it's an animal, it's interested in material things and physical things, sensual things. That's the nature of the animal. The animal is not interested in God, not interested in spirituality. But the animal, if you apply your godly soul to the animal soul, you could change your animal soul. The animal soul could be convinced, if the animal soul is interested in its own interest, in self-interest, and things that are good for you, well, God is also good, and it's good to be close to God. So little by little, you can get the animal soul to come to the recognition that spirituality and godliness is also good. And little by little, the animal soul becomes tame and converted into a positive force, a positive spiritual force. That's why the Talmud says that in the Shema we say you shall love God with all your heart. Now, what's the word for your heart? Livavecha. But that's plural. We should have said libcha. Why does it say livavecha, like your double heart? So the Talmud says because the heart is the symbol of both inclinations. The right ventricle is the good inclination, the left ventricle is the bad inclination. Yetzer hara versus Yetzer tov. And you're supposed to love God with both inclinations. How do you do that? Because ultimately you can transform the animal soul into a loving soul, just like the godly soul is loving. Yes?
I'm curious if there's a teaching that the livavecha, the two hearts, are also a part of the separation of the masculine from feminine and the reunification in marriage in the physical world that refer to two hearts as well.
That's a good point. I'm not familiar if there's such a concept. Because then you're saying that the feminine is associated with the Yetzer hara, with the evil inclination.
No, separate from that. Separate from that.
Well, all explanations are connected.
Sure.
So I don't know. I'm not saying you're wrong, but I don't know. At any rate, when you convert the animal soul, you have an advantage over just having the godly soul in a state of passion for God. Because the godly soul is serene, is at peace. It's not raging. Its love is measured. The animal, the nature of an animal is to be very forceful. An animal will exercise tremendous power and force. When you get your animal soul on the right team, the animal soul energizes the godly soul. And the godly soul becomes more powerful. If the godly soul is left to its own devices, it's great, it's wonderful, it's passionate, but its passion is measured. But when you get the animal soul to join the godly soul, it infuses the godly soul with much more vigor, much more energy. Now, to show how the purpose of the Mishkan, the Tabernacle, and later on the Temple, was about transformation, first suppressing the negative and then converting it. He focuses on the material with which the Mishkan was built. It's called Atzei Shittim wood. What does the word there mean? What is the connotation of that word, that kind of wood? So the Rebbe points out that it says in the Torah that the Jewish people settled in a place called Shittim. That's the name of a place. And what happened in that place? The Jews sinned. Because another example is, it says if a woman commits adultery, the Hebrew word used is siste, which is related to the word Shittim, same root. And the Talmud says, nobody sins unless a spirit of shtus, same root, of folly enters him. What exactly does the word shtus mean, folly? It means deviation. There's a mean, there's a level that's acceptable, and then you could deviate in two directions. You could either go beneath the mean, beneath the line, and act in an idiotic way. You can act in a very foolish way, and then you're called a shota. Shota means an imbecile, a fool, an idiot. A shota is not responsible for his behavior. So a person who sins is a shota, is a fool, because they're deviating from the line, from the proper line. But then there's another kind of shtus, of folly, where you go above the line, where you transcend the norm, you transcend even that which is good and holy and proper. You go beyond the limits of your behavior, of your personality, to do that which is even more holy. And when you do that, you transform the negative folly into positive folly. That's why the Mishkan was made out of Shittim wood, as if to say, it's all about foolishness. We have to, yes?
Foolishness, not evil.
No. Foolishness, it depends which direction your foolishness is. If you go beneath the line, you could then enter into the realm of evil. You could also be someone who's tragically, mentally unstable, and it's not their fault. But when you're going beneath the line in terms of sinning is really folly. Why is it folly? So he explains, and based on the Tanya, that by nature, if you were in touch with your true godly soul's nature, you would never sin. Because when you sin, you're severing your ties with God. Even a small sin is also severing your ties. In other words, I'll give you an example. If you shoot the king, that's a terrible crime. But if you spit in his face, it's also a terrible crime. But you didn't hurt him, just a little moisture, but it's the king. So every time we transgress, we're severing our ties with God. To think that we're intact even after sinning without doing tshuva, without repenting, is the lowest level of foolishness. That we still think that everything is fine and dandy. Our relationship is intact. People like to convince themselves, I know I have my faults, but it's no big deal. No, it is a big deal. And when you recognize it's a big deal, you correct it, of course. And then it isn't a big deal anymore. Then you transform it. So the very act of sinning is an act of folly, that a person thinks that their spiritual state is not affected profoundly because of their sin. And how do we transform it? By acting beyond the level of normalcy. The Talmud tells a story, a powerful story. There was a wedding, and there was a certain rabbi who, Shmuel, the son of Rabbi Yitzchak, would dance in front of the bride, and he would dance and juggle. He would have 3 branches of myrtles. Myrtles are the plants that we use on Sukkot for the lulav. He would take 3 myrtles and he would juggle. And another rabbi, Rabbi Zera, chastised him. He says, "You're embarrassing us." In other words, you're a Torah scholar. You have to be a little bit more normal. You can't just be a clown. You're clowning around there, and it's a disgrace. It's not proper. When this rabbi died, the rabbi who did the juggling, they were able to see fire surround his grave. They saw a spiritual fire. That means that God was saying that this man was above and beyond everyone else who was buried there. So Rabbi Zera then realized, he says, you know what? It was his foolishness that got him to where he was. That his foolishness was transcendent. It wasn't demeaning, on the contrary. So why did he juggle? The rabbi didn't juggle when he came to the academy. He only juggled at a wedding. So the Rebbe explains, because a wedding, Ish and Isha, man and woman, Ish has 2 letters that spell Ish, fire, and Isha has the 2 letters of fire. But they also have another letter. Ish has a Yud, and Isha has a Hey. Together it forms God's name. That means at a wedding, there's a tremendous surge of divine energy, and he felt it, and that generated in him the spirit of transcendence. He was receptive to the transcendent energy that was present at that wedding. And that's why a prophet is referred to as Meshuggah. Meshuggah is the Hebrew word for crazy. A prophet was called crazy. A prophet would take off his garments. That was very unconventional. Why? Because in order to become receptive to divine communication, you had to strip yourself of your personality. You had to transcend your personality. Garments are a metaphor for your intellect, for your emotions. The rest of the time you follow your intellect, you follow your good emotions. But when you wanted to become receptive to divine communication, you had to remove those garments. You had to remove your personality and transcend yourself. And that's the whole objective of creating the sanctuary, that a Jew has the power to transform the foolishness, the negative foolishness, into positive foolishness. Another thing he says, the Mishkan, the Tabernacle, was made out of boards. What is the Hebrew word for board? Keresh. If you take the word Keresh and you rearrange the letters, it reads sheker, false. And then, if you rearrange it, it turns into kesher, a bond, and keresh, a board. Because that's the whole objective of the Mishkan, to take the sheker, the falsehood of the world. And today you don't have to look very far to see that there's not one thing you could possibly trust that the media reports. Everything is distorted. Some of it by design, and some of it is by sloppiness. I don't even know how they could be so wrong about everything. It's hard to find an article that the writers don't get wrong. I mean, just the other week there was this story about the tunnels, the Jewish tunnels. What it was a bunch of, students who were just a little bit overzealous, and they knew that the Rebbe wanted the shul to be expanded, And the shul is in the basement, so they dug the next door's basement, which belongs to the shul, as if to expand it. It's about 30, 40 feet. That's the tunnel where they were trafficking children and all sorts of crazy things. And the media reported this. The media is evil. It's not neutral, it's evil. It's the foolishness, it's the sheker, the falsehood. And that's where people get all their information from. Well,
sorry. It's like a weatherman. He can never get it right.
Journalism has been disembodied from its ethic, its ethos of truth-telling. It's become political.
Right. Media is political. That's one part of it.
And it's propaganda.
But also, I remember there was the Rebbe's brother-in-law passed away. So the New York Times had an obituary, 2 paragraphs. They got about 3 details wrong. It had nothing to do with ideology. It was just shoddy reporting. They don't care about information if it's not about something that they think is very important. And then when it's very important, then they slant it in favor of their ideology. And their ideology is anti-Semitic. It is an anti-Semitic publication, pure, unmitigated anti-Semitism.
The New York Times?
Yes, and most media outlets are anti-Semitic. Yes. I mean, when it's going on in Gaza, the civilian deaths are the product of Hamas, and yet no one is calling out Hamas for it. We should feed the people over there, but no one is talking about the hostages. Release the hostages, we'll feed the people. And the media is not doing that, is not calling out and putting the onus on Israel. That's the example of sheker, but it's not just the media sheker. Society is a tremendous amount of falsehood. And falsehood doesn't just mean that you're lying about something. It means when you don't see reality for what it really is, you look at the world and you see a godless world, that's a lie. The world is not a godless world. The world is filled with God's presence. You just have to open your eyes. You open your eyes, you'll see God's presence in everything. Even in the evil, you'll see God's presence.
But, I mean, the interesting thing about what you just spoke about journalism and the Tabernacle and its reach to correct untruth or distortion in the truth is a very deep connection.
So that's what the whole purpose of the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple, which started with this Mishkan, the sanctuary, is to take the sheker, the falsehood of the world, and transform it.
Was the Mishkan actually incorporated into the first temple?
Good question. No, it wasn't, but it was never destroyed. The Talmud says that anything that Moses laid his hands on lasts forever. And where is the Mishkan now? It's buried underneath the temple.
Okay, so
Right. It's buried there together with the ark.
Right.
It's in a tunnel.
Right.
It's talking about tunnels. It's with the ark, with a jar of manna that was preserved.
Yes,
we just read about yesterday. It's there. The staff of Aaron that sprouted almonds is there, and the oil with which they anointed Aaron and the Mishkan is also there. What?
What about the staff of Moses?
I'm not sure.
I love the jar of manna. That was fascinating.
Right, it was taken out. Jeremiah took it out to show the people.
It's underneath the Temple Mount?
Yeah, it's buried someplace underneath. Maimonides explains, based on the Talmud, that when they built the temple, and King Solomon built the temple, underneath the temple he built chambers and designed that when the temple would be destroyed, they would be able to hide the ark there. So the ark is not in Ethiopia. It's not in... There is an opinion of the Talmud that was taken into Babylonia into exile, but Maimonides favors the opinion that says it was buried underneath the Temple Mount itself.
And the ark was inside the Mishkan?
Yeah.
And
Then it was inside the temple.
We're getting technical here. That's right.
Right, so what is the objective of the sanctuary, starting with the Mishkan, is to take the folly of the world, beneath the line, and turn it into the folly that transcends the line. To take the sheker, the falsehood, and turn it into a kesher, a bond with God, and a keresh, a board that constituted the structure of the Mishkan. So that the tablets are in the ark, yeah. Right. Okay, so that's the gist of this discourse. And then he goes on for another 15 chapters, and he goes deeper and deeper. And one of the points he makes over there is the Jewish people, when they left Egypt, are called Tzivos Hashem, the armies of God. The army of God. An army is there to wage war and win that war. And that's the war that we have to wage to transform this folly of the world into holiness.
Is being waged.
And it's being waged physically as well. So it's a spiritual war, but it's waged. And in order to win that war, he uses the example of a king who has treasures that were never shown to anyone because they were inherited from his father, who inherited from his father. But to win the war, the desire to win is so powerful that he squanders all his treasures and gives it to the foot soldiers that they should use in order to win the war. And the same thing, we're in this battle, and God has given us the greatest treasures, greatest spiritual treasures, in order to win the war and to bring Mashiach. It's interesting that the Rebbe started an organization for children called Tzivos Hashem, the Army of God. He started that in 1980. Shortly after that, in 1982, in Lebanon, an organization started calling itself Hezbollah, the Party of God. So Hasidim say that the Rebbe started the Tzivos Hashem as an antidote to the evil of Hezbollah, almost sharing the same name. That when we recognize that we are soldiers, especially children, to have the greatest power, we can overcome all the evil that comes from the other side. Any questions?
I have a question about this week's parsha and the relationships of the two songs.
Yeah.
Sorry, my brain is. When we have these songs in the Torah, it's not very often that we see them. And is there a particular reason that they come in to the Torah? Is there a particular reason that Hashem decided to have these songs in the Torah?
Well, the whole Torah is actually called a song.
Okay.
But in some places, it's written as a song. The style of writing is different. You have a one line, then the next line is a shorter line, then a wider line. Why? I mean, it says in the midrash that there are 10 songs, 10 divine songs. The first they sang in Egypt. The second one was sung when they crossed the sea. Then there are 7 other songs. The 10th song will be revealed by Mashiach. Okay. And the Hebrew word says, Az Yashir, then Moses will sing. Why does it use the future? Okay. So some say that Yashir is Yud, which is 10, Shir. There are 10 songs, and the 10 will only be complete in the future.
Wow, okay, thank you.
What's the first song? The second one?
The first song is not recorded, but it says that they sang, it's hinted in the book of Isaiah that like the night in which they sang. So they must have sung something. I don't have the notes. So it's not recorded. Okay, everyone have a good day, good week.
Rabbi, have a good day.
You too.
And everyone.
Will there be class next week?
What time is our flight next week? No class? No, I'm flying to my granddaughter's wedding.
Oh, Mazel Tov. Mazel Tov.
Thank you. No, what time our flight was.
When do you return? When do you return?
It relies on you for those.
Oh, so then there will be one, not this coming, but okay, thank you.
How about next Sunday? I was going to have class on from
Next Sunday.
There's no class. There's no class next week.
Oh, okay, so you won't be here next Wednesday?
This coming Wednesday.
Is it usually at 10 and then 11?
A week from today, you won't be.
No, it's actually he's teaching. Oh, just in the front.
Wednesday after, there won't
It's a
be.
second class.
Oh, for today?
Class on Wednesday.
On the